Our first speaker today is Nick Ichien. Nick is a graduate student at UCLA, advised by Hongjing Liu and Keith Holyoake. He received his BA in psychology from New York University and an MSc in the philosophy of social sciences from the London School of Economics. He's interested broadly in the conceptual and visual representations that humans use to make sense of the world, and more specifically, he examines processing of similarity, analogy, metaphor, and causality. And today, Nick's going to be discussing some of the work he's been doing, looking at predicting patterns of similarity among abstract semantic relations. So if you're ready to go, Nick, I'll hand over to you. Nick, are you ready?
I'm sorry, I needed to unmute myself. So, hi everybody, thanks for coming. Let me reshare my screen. Okay, it's good? Great. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So hi everybody, as Matthew mentioned, my name's Nick and I'm a graduate student at UCLA. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. So generally, people can think about things in the world in a lot of different ways. And this broad phenomenon might fall under what's called semantic cognition. For example, most would agree that birds generally fly, or that they generally eat worms or live in nests, or that there's a clear analogy between birds and nests on one hand and bears and caves on the other hand. And these latter observations involve understanding semantic relations, understanding the ways that our concepts of things in the world are related to each other. So today I'm going to talk about a project with Hongjing Liu and Keith Holyoake where we attempted to clarify how people understand and represent these semantic relations. So this project centered around three main questions. The first was whether people's similarity judgments among word pairs discriminate between the abstract semantic relations that those word pairs exemplify. The second was whether individual differences in fluid intelligence and crystallized verbal intelligence are associated with these discriminations. And finally, we wanted to see if computational models could predict these similarity judgments. So if we think about mental representations of various things as populating some sort of psychological space, judged similarity between things can be thought of as the mental closeness of things in that psychological space. So given that, we collected similarity judgments between relations expressed by word pairs to characterize the psychological space of semantic relations. To get these judgments, we asked participants to arrange word pairs based on the similarity of their relations. So their instructions were to arrange word pairs so that those with more similar relations were closer together and those with more dissimilar relations were farther apart. The general idea with this measure is that the distance between word pairs represents how dissimilar their relations are to each other. So here we were looking at how much people's arrangements on this task grouped together word pairs that exemplified the same abstract or similar abstract semantic relations and separated word pairs that exemplified different semantic relations. So participants arranged different sets of word pairs across multiple trials of this task. And the distance between word pairs across trials are aggregated in what's called a representational dissimilarity matrix, shown to the right. So in this figure, each cell represents a pairwise judgment between two word pairs. And the color of that cell represents the dissimilarity between those two word pairs. Warmer colors indicate greater dissimilarity, and cooler colors indicate less dissimilarity or greater similarity. And then the diagonal represents the dissimilarity between a word pair and itself, which is assumed to be 0. So that's a dark blue diagonal right there. So in addition to having participants complete this multi-arrangement task to collect similarity judgments from them, we had them also complete 2 more tasks to estimate their fluid and crystallized verbal intelligence. So we estimated participants' fluid intelligence using the Raven's progressive matrices, which can be thought of as a sort of tricky visual analogy or rule induction task where participants are given an array of images and they're asked to select an image from a set of options that best completes the pattern instantiated by that array. And just in case you're curious, I think the correct answer for this problem is this fifth option here. And so even though this is a purely visual task, we use it to measure some domain general ability that's plausibly involved in holding multiple relations in mind that might aid in judging similarity between word pairs in a way that clearly delineates between the relations that those word pairs exemplify. And then we estimated participants' crystallized verbal intelligence using the semantic similarities test, where participants are given two concepts at a time and then asked to characterize how those two concepts are similar to each other. So examples of concept pairs that participants describe in this task are bird and airplane shown here, but also loneliness and desert, marriage and alloy. And so this test involves characterizing the semantic similarity between two individual concepts at a time, rather than judging the relational similarity between two sets of concepts. Despite this difference, this task and a multi-arrangement task both rely on understanding different aspects of word meanings. So we expected that performance on this task would be associated with participants' ability to discriminate among abstract semantic relations with their similarity judgments. And so we actually collected two data sets of performance on all of these tasks. And these two data sets differed in the word pairs used for the multi-arrangement task. So I'll show you those stimuli now. So what you're looking at are the word pairs that we use in one data set. Italicized are the subtypes of semantic relations that the word pairs exemplify. And so we use 3 word pairs to exemplify each one of 9 relation subtypes, italicized here. And those were categorized along 3 relation types in the white font. And so I'll just give you a chance to take a look at these word pairs. We chose these stimuli from the SemiVal 2012 Task 2 dataset. So this dataset's really big. It has about 3,200 word pairs that are chosen as examples of 79 subtypes of semantic relations. So we use 9 of those subtypes here. And then those 79 subtypes in the data set are categorized under 10 broad types of semantic relations. So we use 3 of those semantic relation types here. And then these are the word pair stimuli that we use in our second data set. So we used 3 word pairs, 3 new word pairs exemplify 9 new semantic relation subtypes, each categorized across 3 new broad relation types. So just give you another chance to take a look at these stimuli here. So just as a note, the actual stimuli that participants saw were just these word pairs, and the italicized and bolded labels are kind of just our way of categorizing those stimuli. And then here's a design matrix with stimulus labels for our first data set. In this RDM, word pairs of the same relation subtype are treated as identical to each other. And then word pairs of the same relation subtype, or different relation subtypes, but the same relation type are treated as broadly similar to each other in these green regions. And then word pairs that are belonging to different relation types are treated as maximally different from each other, as indicated by these yellow regions. And so I'm just showing you this design matrix so you can see the similarity structure of our stimulus sets and better understand our actual data on the next slide. So these are the mean similarity judgments that participants generated across our 2 data sets. So similarity judgments in the first data set seem to discriminate between types as indicated by these bigger blue boxes for similar, contrast, and cause-purpose relation types. And they also seem to discriminate among subtypes within each type as indicated by these darker little blue boxes. And then on the other hand, similarity judgments for the second set of word pairs seem to discriminate between types for class inclusion relations and between subtypes for the part-whole and space-time relations, these small blue boxes. So next, I'm going to show you results testing whether these judgments distinguish between relation types. And so for each relation type, I took the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of the same relation type and compared that to the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of different relation types. Okay. So here we see that similarity judgments discriminate between broad relation types for our entire data set. But it's important to keep in mind that these part-whole and space-time relation types, this effect is largely probably driven by the pairwise judgments between word pairs of the same relation subtype. Next, I'll show results testing whether these similarity judgments distinguish between these relation subtypes. So to do that, for each relation type, I took the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of the same relation subtype, right? And compared that to the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of different relation subtypes, but still belonging to the same relation type. And so here, the similarity judgments are shown to discriminate between relation subtypes for both experiments, with the exception of these class inclusion relations. So across the two data sets, we see that similarity judgments between word pairs do seem to discriminate between abstract semantic relations that those word pairs exemplify. We see that this discriminability at both the broad type level and the subtype level for the similar, contrast, and cause-purpose relation types. And we see discriminability at either the broad type level, as with the class inclusion relation type, or the subtype level, as with the part-whole and space-time relation types. So now that we've looked at the mean similarity judgments across each data set, we'll now look at the similarity judgments generated by individual participants. So what I've done is I've shown RDMs or similarity judgments for individual subjects, just to give you a sense of the variability of performance across different participants on this task. So in order to capture this variability, what we did is we calculated what we called a type discriminability index, reflecting participants' ability to distinguish word pairs under the same relation type from those under different relation types. So to get this index, I divided the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of different relation types, so just the mean value across this white region in this sort of template RDM, and divided that by the pairwise judgment between word pairs of the same relation type. And so across both the data sets, performance on the Raven's progressive matrices, again, that visual reasoning task aimed at measuring fluid intelligence, is linearly associated with these type discriminability indices. As with performance on the SST, remember that verbal reasoning task aimed at measuring crystallized verbal intelligence. So we also calculated what we called a subtype discriminability index, and this reflected participants' ability to distinguish word pairs under the same relation subtype from those under different relation subtypes. So to get this index, we divided the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of different relation subtypes, but the same relation type, so this in this light gray regions. And we divided that by the mean pairwise judgment between word pairs of the same relation subtype. And so across both the data sets, again, performance on the RPM was linearly associated with these subtype discriminability indices, and so was performance on the SST. Importantly, we computed partial correlations to see how well the Raven's progressive matrices, that fluid intelligence measure, and the semantic similarities test, that crystallized verbal intelligence measure, each uniquely predicted participants' discriminability indices. So here, RPM was consistently the better predictor of relation discriminability at both the type and subtype level. So this suggests a particularly strong association between this ability to discriminate between abstract semantic relations and some domain general relational reasoning ability over and above just verbal knowledge. Okay, so now that I've talked through some of the behavioral results of our project, I'm going to talk about our attempts to predict these similarity judgments using 3 different computational models, each representing relations differently. So first, it's important to spend a little bit of time talking about how we represented individual word meanings, since each of these models use those individual word meanings as inputs to capture the relations between those individual word meanings. So one general observation about our data that's corroborated by other empirical work on semantic relations suggests that they're not represented in a binary or all or none way that corresponds to the design matrix. Rather, people seem to represent semantic relations in a way so that word pairs exemplify certain abstract relations with varying degrees of typicality, and that the similarity between word pairs is graded. So for example, hot and cold more typically exemplify opposites than do warm and cold. Also, the relation between hot and cold is more similar to the one between warm and cold than it is the one between bird and nest, right? So with that being the case, we wanted to represent individual word meanings in a way that could ultimately capture this graded nature. Specifically, we used word-to-vec word embeddings, which represents individual word meanings as 300-dimensional vectors. So each word meaning is represented as a vector of 300 values. So our first model represents word pairs merely as the combination of those individual word meanings, merely as the combination of those word-to-vec word embeddings that are representing each individual word meaning. So here, no attempt is made at representing the relation between word pairs beyond the information captured in the individual word meanings, right? So here's our example. This would be the relational representation of love and hate, that word pair. It would just be the combination of the love vector and the hate vector. And so this approach behaves very similarly as averaging the 2 word vectors. You can roughly think of this model as averaging 2 dots in the semantic space. The semantic space is just the sort of 300-dimensional representational space that's used to represent individual word meanings in with these word-to-vec vectors. So here we have a vector representing woman and a vector representing man. And so what this model does is it just sort of behaves similarly to just averaging those 2 vectors. And so this is what the man-woman relation would sort of look like. In a second model, it sort of represents word pairs as the difference between the word vectors coding individual word meanings. So here some attempt is made at specifically representing the relation between each pair of words that's distinct from the individual word meanings. But that relation is represented only implicitly as connections between concepts in the semantic space. And again, it's important to note that it's that the representation of the relations between words is using that same representational space used to represent individual word meanings. And I'm making a point there, and it'll make a little bit more sense when we talk about the explicit relation model in the next slide. But anyway, this model, what it does is it takes those same input vectors and it just represents the relation between them by finding the vector difference between those 2. And so our third model, BART, represents relations explicitly in a representational space that's distinct from the semantic space used to represent individual word meanings. So I'm going to kind of unpack that a little bit. This model first explicitly learns a set of abstract semantic relations and then codes the relation between a given word pair according to how typical an example that relation is for each of the learned abstract semantic relations. Okay, so a learned abstract semantic relation in this kind of geometric diagram would maybe sort of code the different dimensions of this new representational space. And so to represent love-hate, you would have the love and hate's typicality, the extent to which love and hate is a typical relation of this first learned relation, the second learned relation, and third learned relation, and so on. So it's a vector of essentially the extent to which a given word pair instantiates a series of learned abstract semantic relations. So here we see that BART, again, our explicit relation model, does the best at capturing human similarity judgments. And so to sort of create these similarity judgments, we just took each model's representation of the word pairs and just computed the cosine distance between every pair of word pairs in our data set. And looking at the RDMs is interesting in that it sort of gives you a sense of how each of these models is sort of characterizing the kind of qualitative structure, similarity structure of these word pairs. And it's clear here also that BART does the best at capturing that qualitative structure. Pretty much BART's RDM is more similar to the human RDM. But then, so here we have just the bivariate correlations between BART's predictions of the pairwise similarity judgments with the humans, and then word-to-vec diffs, that implicit relation model's correlation with the human pairwise judgments, and same with word-to-vec concat, that non-relation model. So another thing to note are these correlations in parentheses. So since word-to-vec concat strictly codes the semantic meaning of the individual words comprising each word pair, we computed partial correlations between human similarity judgments and BART, as well as word-to-vec diff. These semi-partial correlations in parentheses show that BART's able to explain human similarity judgments over and above what's already explained by the semantic meaning coded in word-to-vec concat. And then we see a similar pattern with our second data set. So again, here we see that BART clearly captures, again, that qualitative structure of human similarity judgments, and also has higher sort of bivariate correlation with human pairwise judgments than word-to-vec diff and word-to-vec concat. And then the semi-partial correlations showing how much of the human judgment BART predicts over and above just the semantic meaning of the word pairs is also much stronger than the implicit relation model. Finally, we took each individual participant's set of similarity judgments. Again, we have a full set of similarity judgments between each word pair in our data sets for each individual participant. We correlated that with BART's predictions of similarity judgments. And so then we took each individual participant's correlation coefficient, estimated essentially how BART-like their similarity judgments were, and we correlated that with their RPM scores. And so this analysis suggests that higher fluid intelligence yields a higher correlation with BART's similarity judgments. So I'm just gonna go just to wrap up and go through the different conclusions from this project. First, human similarity judgments between word pairs reflect distinctions among abstract semantic relations. Individual differences in fluid intelligence more strongly predict the degree to which these similarity judgments discriminate between abstract semantic relations. And then BART, that explicit relation model, predicts mean human similarity judgments as well as individual differences in relational similarity judgments better than the implicit relation model word-to-vec diff and the semantic model or non-relational model word-to-vec concat. And so we're kind of taking that last result to suggest that explicit representation of relations is necessary to fully account for human semantic cognition, in particular judgments about the semantic relations expressed by word pairs. So that's everything for me. I want to thank my advisors, Hongjing Liu and Keith Holyoke, as well as my lab mates in the Computational Vision and Learning Lab at UCLA and the Reasoning Lab at UCLA.